There's a ton of noise out there. So how do you get decision makers to pay attention to your brand? Start a podcast and invite your ideal clients to be guests on your show. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show. Welcome back to B2B Growth. I'm your host for today's episode, Logan Lyles with Sweetfish Media. Today's episode is another in our Why Podcast Work series, and it's a very special one because we're actually going to turn it internal and speak to a member of our team who's had a podcast of their own for quite a while. I'm going to be talking with Keri Roberts, who is our podcast brand and launch manager here at Sweetfish Media, and also the host of Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things. Keri, how's it going today?
It is good. I'm so excited to chat with you about this today, Logan. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to do another episode in Why Podcasts Work, where we're talking about the different ways that people are seeing value in having their own podcast. And this is the first one that we've done with someone on our team. You've actually had your podcast for a number of years before being part of the Sweetfish Media team. But for folks who aren't familiar with you, like I and the rest of the team here at Sweetfish are, give us a little bit of background on yourself, your role here at Sweetfish, and then we'll start talking about your podcast and your journey there.
Yeah. So like you were saying, I am the brand and launch manager. So it's my job to help companies and people really pull out their story, really pull out what makes them great, what makes them unique, and showcase that brand in an audio fashion, and then really helping them launch their show. So that's a huge piece of what I do here. My background is actually a lot in dance and health and fitness and marketing. And so it's been great to kind of pull everything that I love together as I work here at Sweetfish.
Yeah, absolutely. You do a great job of pulling together, the different skills that you've built and your passion, which is something that I always comes to mind when I think of you on our team and what you're doing. So I'm really excited. You've recently, made the transition into this role because of those proficiencies and the passion you have for those aspects of producing a podcast. And I imagine some of that comes from having your own show for the last 4.5 years. Again, the name of your show is Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things. Give us a little bit of the context, why you initially started that show, what it's about, and your path into podcasting there.
Yeah. So I have always felt that everyone should be heard and seen and cared for. And it didn't matter if I was doing that in my day job. I owned a dance studio for a while. I did it in dance. And I just kind of had this idea. I was listening to podcasts a few years ago, and I was like, I'd really love to do a show. What would mine be about? And I just wanted to create a space where people's voices could be heard. I felt like there were so many people around us every day doing and being great. And because they didn't have maybe the connection, or they weren't a famous person or a celebrity in their area, they weren't given that opportunity. And I wanted to be that space to have them just share their story and who they are. And I'm almost up to 300 episodes. It's been amazing to hear the growth. Just so many different people from all over the world, their stories, but then kind of this same pattern throughout of really pushing through adversity and trying and doing what you love. And it's just been a really neat thing. And so the show started with that. And then it kind of became this question for myself of, what's the difference between these people? What's the difference between somebody's mindset of their ability to move forward in life instead of stopping where they're at? And so I went in and I was like, you know what, I'm going to really dive into the science of this. And so I started interviewing psychologists and therapists on the science of personal growth and what's happening in our brain and how can we change our mindset so that we can all grow and live this life that we want. And then kind of the third piece of the show is just kind of my thoughts and insights, because people had started asking, well, what do you do? And what are the things that you're learning and reading? And so the show is really about providing inspiration, providing educational tools to improve your personal growth and mindset, and then just kind of thoughts and comments that I like to share as well.
Absolutely. You hit on something there that I'm always recommending to a lot of our customers is that they work into, even if they don't start out that way, they work into a varied approach with the content of their podcast, kind of like you're doing. You're interviewing, people who are achieving things, and then you're interviewing experts on different facets of achievement and personal growth, and then sharing solo episodes or your individual shares. I think there's a lot of benefit to be had by approaching a podcast in that way and varying up the content. It gives that kind of freshness to the content and a little bit of variety as well. So I love that. Tell us a little bit about some of the biggest benefits you've seen. As we mentioned, you've been doing your own podcast for 4.5 years, multiple times per week, right?
Yeah. So I post 3 times a week. And for me, I personally have always loved meeting new people, talking to new people. I'm a pretty extroverted person. So this definitely fit within like my excitement and my passion and who I am as a person. But you just never know who knows who, and you never know what you're going to learn, and you never know what might inspire you to take the next step in life of whatever that is for you. So I've talked to people from all over, of all walks of life, and people that are doing things that I know nothing about and I don't necessarily have an interest in, but I'm interested in these people because they're so excited about it. So it's really about creating these connections, because you just don't know who knows who and how you can help someone else. And that's kind of that first piece. I think the second piece is, really developing a skill set of understanding how to interview someone, how to brand them, how to tell their story, then kind of the behind the scenes. How do you edit it? How do you share that online? How do you market it? So it was kind of a very interesting thing that is part of what led me to your company and finding your company and working for you guys. So that is a huge win for me as well. And it's just something that people ask about. How do you know so many people? How are you creating these connections? How are you networking? So it's just kind of the new way to network that I think is so great about it as well.
Yeah, I love that you touched on that as well, Keri. Here on the show, listeners have heard us talk about content-based networking and the fact that when you collaborate on content with someone, it's a great way to produce content like you're doing with your show around personal growth, but you're also building your network, not just with listeners, but with the guests that you have on your show. And as you mentioned, you don't know who those people know, who they might connect you with that could lead to another opportunity. Any interesting stories that you'd like to share in relationships that you've built that kind of led to something more or a surprising outcome or something like that when it comes to, the relationships with the guests that you've built over the time and the interviews that you've done?
Yeah, I think, some of the stories are just very touching for me. I think on a personal note, one of the cool things that listeners don't get to hear is when I'm doing the kind of ordinary people component, I will have people after the interview is done and we've stopped recording say to me, "Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for giving me a chance to share my story. I feel lighter. I needed to let that go. I needed to have someone hear it, even if it's only you." And to me, like that means so much more sometimes than people listening around the world. And I think, we all just want to be heard. And I think there's something really special about that. And when we can kind of give value up front and just come and talk to people as people, we're not trying to sell, we're not trying to push, we're not trying to take, we're just really trying to build a connection. They in turn generally like you because you cared and you made them feel good. And so it's been interesting because sometimes later they'll be like, "Hey, I have a guest that should be on your show." Or, there's I know you're doing psychologists on the show. This psychologist is doing great things. Or because now I've done so many, I'll have people reach out to me that have books or people in the psychology space that are at a very high level that I get excited about. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, they want to be on my show." And normally you're paying so much for their coaching or so much for their time. And they're coming here to share with me and my audience what they're about. So I think that that's been huge. And, just the different connections that you make in business as well. I mean, I've had people on the show that are at high levels. Someone worked for Anheuser-Busch, and that particular person just said to me, thank you for just talking to me as a human being. Everyone's always trying to get something from me because I'm at a high level. Thank you for letting me share my story about why I do what I do. And so it's just kind of that nice connection because, it's not something maybe I need or want from him right now, but you just never know how the two of us can help one another in business or in life. So I really come at it as just get to know people as people and just give and just care. And that will produce a lot of dividends back later in life.
Yeah, absolutely. Folks who follow, James and I on LinkedIn, I think he started the hashtag that I jumped on and was like, I love that. Even before I was a part of the team here at Sweetfish was value first. How can we deliver value to the people in our network? Because it is going to come back around to you in some ways and sometimes in surprising ways, as you alluded to there, Keri. Tell us a little bit about some of the advice that you would give to folks who are thinking about starting a podcast, either for personal reasons or for their brand. If they're, leading a marketing team and thinking about, how can we make connections with folks in our market? How can we use a podcast to create the sort of content that we want to get out there? For you, it was around personal growth and achievement and really achieving your goals. But everybody has, as you mentioned, a story that they're trying to tell. But if they are either intimidated by the idea of having their own podcast or where to get started, what would be some of your advice to folks? You've obviously been able to sustain it for quite a while yourself.
Yeah, I think, a podcast is similar to a business, and I've owned a business before. I owned a dance studio. I think one of the things that's interesting is you really just have to start because you want to and start with a passion and this idea of, I want to interview people about this thing. And don't overthink it. If your thing is, I want to interview people about marketing, or I want to interview people in the salon space, I just want to interview them and just talk. And I think what happens is as you start to do those interviews, the clarity of why you're doing what you're doing starts to form. I mean, I only started with once a week and doing those kind of everyday people interviews, and the psychology therapy one didn't come until much later. So I think it's starting with one thing. What are you passionate about? What do you want to know about? What's the community that you want to be building around what topic, and not overthink, what level they're at. I have to get the best guest, because I'll be honest, the people that are not at the cream of the crop actually share it more because they've never been heard before, and their friends and family and their fellow employees are listening to it and responding to it. And now I want to listen to it. So it's very interesting. Sometimes it's not, the number one person to have on your show is going to give you the most listens or the best connections. So I think that's a huge piece of it, but really looking at what is the community you want to build and around what topic, and then just start with that.
Yeah, I love that. Obviously, our friend Sangram over at Terminus all the time is saying, without a community, you are simply a commodity. And so much of us here at Sweetfish, identify and really love that saying that Sangram and his team are all about. And it's evident in, what you're talking about in the way that you've built community with your show, the way you help our clients do it with their show, Keri. The other thing you touched on is, not focusing on, to have a successful podcast, you have to have these huge names on the show. And we hear that from clients a lot. I'm sure you've heard that in working with clients as well. And, something I've heard James talk about before is, well, yeah, you get those big names, but they really don't have the incentive to share and promote that episode. It's probably not going to give you the lift that you think it's going to. Whereas when you're interviewing folks in the community that you want to build, sometimes those are, quote unquote, ordinary people, and they really have more incentive to share. And they're proud of the fact that they were highlighted on your show, and they feel appreciative for you highlighting them and giving them a chance to talk about, like your example with the executive at Anheuser, and really appreciating just you featuring them and let them talk about the things that are important to them. And it's a great way to build community. Well, Keri, this has been fantastic. It's always fun when you and I get to chat. I'm glad that we finally got to do it and record it and have it here on the show. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. And I'm so happy to be a part of this team and help spread the love of podcasting.
Absolutely, Keri. If anybody listening to this isn't already connected with you, what's the best way for them to find you? LinkedIn, social media, your show. What's the best way for them to follow up with you?
Yeah, so I'm Keri Roberts, Keri, on LinkedIn, or on Instagram is another good place where I really talk a lot about the podcast. So it's Keri, Keri.n.Roberts. And the show is Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things.
Awesome. We'll link to it in the show notes as well. Keri, this has been a ton of fun. Thanks for being the first member of the Sweetfish team on the Why Podcast Work series. This was fun.
Thank you.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.